The French Revolution is still being fought, now with pens instead of muskets. The events of the years at the end of the 18th century are still changing, and it's the best example of the shifting trends in historiography and how the past is created by the present. Understanding the revolution has been so important politically that within years it was being debated by two of the most influential fathers of modern politics, Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke. Burke, a Conservative Member of Parliament in Britain, argued that sweeping away the past so drastically meant sweeping away crucial parts of societal stability that you might not have intended. Sometimes referred to as the father of modern conservatism, Burke argued for gradual and careful change to improve society. Paine, on the other hand, was a man of the Enlightenment and a staunch believer in individual rights, liberties, and doing away with the unjustified power of unelected monarchs and popes. Burke published his reflections on the revolutions in France in 1790, and Paine replied with his famous Rights of Man, published in 2 parts over the next 2 years. He argued that governments should govern by universal principles, accessible by reason, rather than by the whims of those figures and institutions passed down through generational tradition. Where Burke supported pragmatic tradition and experience, Paine favoured the abstract ideals of the Enlightenment, believing you could create a blueprint for a new society. Paine supported the idea of a break from the past, partly because of his support for America's break from Britain. The first major historical study of the Revolution came over 60 years later, with Alexis de Tocqueville's The Old Regime and the French Revolution. Taking the side of Burke, de Tocqueville made the influential argument that the revolution made no real difference to French society, that the revolutionaries ended up replacing centralised feudal and monarchical control with centralised aristocratic control. Where the Jacobins made a resolute attempt to break completely with an unjust past, they actually unconsciously retained most of the sentiments, habits and ideas which the old regime had taught them and by whose aid they achieved the revolution, and that without intending it, they used its ruins as materials for the construction of their new society. By the first centenary of the Revolution in 1889, the City Council of Paris had created the first chair of the history of the French Revolution, the holder of which being widely regarded as the preeminent expert on the Revolution. The first holder of the chair, Alphonse Hollade, differed starkly from de Tocqueville. The Revolution was justified, the Ancien Regime was despotic, and the past needed sweeping away violently, which led on to the question of the Terror and Robespierre. Was he as despotic as the kings that preceded him, or a shrewd protector of the revolution, simply responding to the dangers and demands of the time? In 1927, Hollade's student Albert Mathiez argued the latter. He defended the Terror as necessary, but there was another reason why he did. He was a Marxist. And Marxism in the 20th century would alter the narrative of the revolution over 100 years after it had happened. Now Marxist historians started to look at 1789 through a different lens. 1789 was part of a greater, inevitable economic shift from feudalism to capitalism that would later lead to another shift from capitalism to communism. The French Revolution was a bourgeois revolution, led by class conflict. It was all part of the dialectical movement of history. For Georges Lefebvre, marking the height of the Marxist interpretation in 1947, it was the bourgeoisie and new wealth, rather than the peasants or the populace, that turned the cogs of the revolution. Interpretations of 1789 were so inextricably tied to the events of the 21st century that the revolutionaries in Russia in 1917 were desperately on the lookout for their Robespierre, their terror. Many thought it was Trotsky, but Russian revolutionaries wrote about the revolution and acted out their own revolution according to their understanding of the direction 1789 took. So where conservatives wrote histories focusing on elite figures, and liberals might focus on the ideas of Enlightenment philosophy, Marxists focused on macroeconomic and social factors. The evidence they selected and the writings they produced then would be wildly different. With universities overwhelmingly on the left though, the Marxist interpretation dominated. But in 1954, the tide began to turn. Alfred Cockburn noted in a famed lecture that only 13% of the leaders of the Third Estate, the estate that opposed the aristocracy and the church, were merchants and businessmen. This weakened the Marxist belief that it was primarily a bourgeois revolution. And as Marxist influence dwindled throughout the latter half of the 20th century, a shift in the historiography followed. The focus shifted from economic and macro analysis to language and discourse, sometimes influenced by postmodernism and the linguistic turn. In 1978, Francois Furet argued that it was the words of philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau that were the prime revolutionary motivator. But ironically, Furet had come full circle, arguing that there was a change in ideas that meant the people, rather than the king, was now sovereign, left the underlying power relationships and logics intact. Democracy in practice, but business as usual behind the scenes. Like de Tocqueville, Furet argued that the revolutionaries didn't really achieve much, but Furet had broke the Marxist mould. And what was at stake has as much to do with today as 200 years ago. If the French Revolution was needless, if change of the period was conservative, then the neoconservatism of today had much evidence to draw upon. History is politics. If you can prove that revolutions don't achieve much, then you have good evidence for practicing conservative politics today. In the introduction to a book on the recent debates of the revolution, Gary Cates cites Simon Schama's Citizens, published in 1989, exactly 200 years after the start of the revolution, as the high point of conservative revisionism, arguing that Schama's prose echoes both Burke and even Thatcher. The questions of the revolution, then, are a dialogue between the past and the present. As the historian Hayden White said, what is at issue here is not what are the facts, but rather how are the facts to be described in order to sanction one mode of explaining them rather than another. It's the first lesson of reading history. Ask who wrote this and why. If you like these videos and would like to support me making more, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook by clicking the links in the description below. You can like this video and subscribe to the Then and Now channel to see more. And if you're feeling really generous, you can pledge as little as $1 towards the creation of each new video. You can click here to find out more. Thank you.